welcome back to Building Integrity. I'm your host, Josh Porter, and in this video, we're going to start talking about Millennium Towers. A lot of you guys have been asking me to cover this, and this is a tower in San Francisco that is leaning and sinking, and this is not something that was built 40 years ago or even 30 years ago. This is modern construction, and so we're going to get into this comedy of errors and the players that are involved and the politics that are involved, and we're going to cover the engineering principles that are involved. But in this video, we're going to give you the rundown, make sure everybody's on the same page and that we're all talking about the same thing. So what is Millennium Towers? It is a 645-foot tall, 58-story reinforced concrete building. Now, this project also included a 12-story building, but we're not going to be talking about that. That doesn't seem to be the one that has the problems. This project included 419 total residential units selling for an average of about $1.8 million each unit. The main tower, which is the one we're going to be talking about in this video series, is the fourth tallest building in San Francisco, and it's the tallest reinforced concrete structure in San Francisco. And arguably, because the other structures are steel and this one's reinforced concrete, it is probably the heaviest structure in San Francisco area. This thing was built not on pilings with piling caps, but instead just, you can imagine it as just one big giant piling cap. It's called a 10-foot thick foundation mat. So this thing's 10-foot solid thick concrete with reinforcement. Now below that, it has a series of friction piles that are about 60 to 90 feet deep each. And these piles are installed into clay and sand, and some of them go into the Old Bay clay area, which we'll talk about in future videos. Now, when they developed and designed this, they estimated, the design engineers and geotechnical engineers estimated that this building would sink on average relatively evenly about 6 inches over the course of its entire life, okay? Now, the current sinking level, as I sit here today, is 18 inches, okay? This building has sunk 18 inches. And because it has sunk unevenly, it's actually leaning to the west 24 inches and it's leaning to the north 8 inches as of the latest records that I have. Now, let me give you a little bit of the history of this building. In 2009, the construction of the tower was completed, okay? In 2011, and this kind of came out in some of the lawsuits, the developers learned that the tower was actually leaning, not settling evenly, and that it was settling at an accelerated rate compared to what they had estimated. In 2011, they also, their neighbor, which is the Transbay Terminal, began demolition. So they were going to retrofit and upgrade and update the Transbay Terminal, which is right next to this project site. So demolition of the old Transbay Terminal began in 2011. And in order to do that work in the subsurface and the underground work, they had to start dewatering the area. Now, in 2015, you could finally start seeing above ground activity. So they spent about 4 years doing the subsurface work and the underground work of the Transbay, which is now being called the Transbay Transit Center, and it changes its name again later. I'll get into that. But in 2015, you could start actually seeing construction activity of the Transbay Transit Center above ground. Now in 2016, so remember, the developer learned of this allegedly in 2011, and in 2016, the leaning and sinking problem finally became public knowledge, so it was made public. The Millennium Tower developers blamed the Transbay Joint Powers Authority. Now, the Transbay Joint Powers Authority were the ones building the Transbay Transit Center right next door. Now, they blamed them for dewatering the soil and causing the building to sink at an accelerated rate. So in other words, if you followed any of my series on Champlain Tower South, it's this idea that, hey, the developers did foundational work and it caused damage to my building. So this is the same argument that the Millennium Tower developers are making against the Transbay Joint Powers Authority. Now, the Transbay Joint Powers Authority, though, they blamed Millennium Towers, the developers, for not building the foundation to the bedrock. This is going to be an incredible key piece of everything that's going on, is why wasn't it built to the bedrock? What does that mean? And so on. Now, around this time, around this 2016 era, is when most of the lawsuits were filed. And the interesting and kind of clever thing that the association did, because this is a condo building, right? And one of the things that the condo association did was, instead of suing the developer directly, they actually sued the Transbay Joint Powers Authority because by doing that under state law in California, they were able to recover their attorney's fees. Whereas if they had sued the developer and been awarded, let's say they got awarded $100 million, roughly 30 to 40 million of that would have gone to the attorneys. But instead they sued the Joint Powers Authority, and then they just expected the Joint Powers Authority to subrogate and sue the developer. And so it's kind of a clever move that the association did by not suing the developer in this case, but by suing the neighbor and letting them sort it out whose fault it actually was. Now, in 2018, the Trans-Bay Transit Center was finally completed. Okay, it was also around this time that the engineer that was retained in order to fix the leaning problem, his name is Ron Hamburger. Okay, he revealed in 2018 what he called his final resolution, which was to underpin part of the building to fix the problem. Now, we're going to go in much more depth in that in a future video, but again, the purpose here is to just kind of give you a rundown and give you the chronology of how everything happened and sort of set the stage, right? In 2020, in October, the litigation finally reached a settlement, and part of this settlement was that they were going to implement Mr. Hamburger's fix to install piles on part of the building down to the bedrock, and then retrofit and fasten those piles into the side of the existing foundation mat. Now, this work started in 2021 in a serious way, and around June, and it actually ended up making the tilting worse. So the work that the contractor was doing to drive these new piles in down to the bedrock and the casings, and we'll get into all the details in that in a future video, but the work that they did actually made the building tilt even more. And they actually had to put a moratorium and stop the work being done. And they had to kind of come up with a solution and better testing and better observation and site inspections in order to prevent this work from making it worse. Now, in January of this year, so just a couple weeks ago, the San Francisco Government Audit and Oversight Committee had a hearing to kind of give an update before this work resumes. In order to make a recommendation whether to let the work resume or not. And in this situation, you can use which we will be using lots of clips from in future videos. But I wanted to kind of share this one clip real quick with you from Supervisor Aaron Preskin, who has been involved in this problem since 2016, possibly before, and just sort of you can almost just hear tangibly the frustration and exhaustion in his voice. So take a listen to this.
Chair Preston and members of the Government Audit and Oversight Committee, thank you for hearing this again. You last heard this on November 4th. I held quite a number of hearings in 2016 when the revelations about the differential settlement, i.e. tilting of 301 Mission Street, first came to the fore. We start this new year 2022 as we ended last year and many other years with the Millennium Tower continuing to sink and tilt. I know that the title of this hearing is about progress, but progress has been going the opposite direction with the perimeter pile, quote unquote, fix.
Okay, so some things that we are going to be talking about in future videos. I kind of wanted, since I can't get into everything, it's a very complex situation, lots of players, lots of engineering principles going on here, things to learn. I can't get into all of it in this first video, but I wanted to go ahead and kind of give you a rundown of what you can expect in these future videos. So what we're going to be talking about in the future is why wasn't the pilings driven to the bedrock in the first place? How will this partial underpinning solution actually work, or how is it proposed to work versus how it will actually work? Why not underpin the entire building? Okay, and that's going to be part of that question, and you'll see why, because there are other engineers out here who think this fix is completely insane, and they're warning the public not to do it. So it's a very interesting dynamic here. So is the underpinning even needed? Okay, so there's some really interesting stuff that has come out saying or showing that really the underpinning is all for show and it's all for property values and it has nothing to do with actually fixing the building. Why did the underpinning work make the building actually tilt more? Who is going to be, or who was responsible, because a lot of those lawsuits are already settled, who was responsible for the original problem? And I care less about what what the lawsuit claimed, because this isn't a criminal case, this is a civil case. So I care less about who actually won or lost the lawsuit, and I care more about ethically, as an engineer, who should be responsible for the original problem. Second question, and there's a blame game obviously going on there, as there always is, fingers pointing at each other. Who is responsible for the problems that the underpinning work caused? Because remember, the underpinning work made the building tilt even more, okay? Here's another question I want to try to address in a future video is how can the solution be worse than the problem? And what happens in the case of an earthquake without these additional piles, if these additional piles aren't installed? What happens in the case of an earthquake with the additional piles installed as proposed by Mr. Hamburger? Well, what would happen in the case of an earthquake with additional piles put around the entire building? These are questions that really honestly haven't been answered, and they really haven't been analyzed to many engineers' satisfaction. The foundation mat was found to be dishing, but literally the explanation, which is essentially, the entire foundation slab floor is kind of got this sloped bow to it, right? And we call this dishing. Well, this usually results in cracking of the underside of the mat. It can also result in cracking of the tops of the friction piles. And of course, there's also lots of spalling happening where we're losing cover over rebar of some of the shear walls and things in the basement level, and nobody really seems to be talking about these or what's causing them. And so we're going to kind of try to look at a lot of that. And I think one of the things that I find a little alarming is the explanation given by the experts who are in charge right now is essentially, well, we walked the garage and we didn't see any cracks, and so therefore we have no reason to believe that the foundation is cracked. I mean, it's a 10-foot thick foundation. You can't see everything from below from just walking on the top of the slab. So it seems a little strange and odd to me. Well, I hope you guys stick around for this series. It's going to be really interesting. I'm going to try to teach you guys a lot of engineering principles, and we're also going to dig into the politics and the parties involved. And hopefully you guys stick along and enjoy the ride. I appreciate it.